Today, if you want to buy a house, a car, a holiday, or even a fridge, you're given every incentive to borrow money on the never never. You're positively encouraged to get into debt. So it seems incredible that just a century ago, you could be imprisoned for life for owing just a few shillings. By law, a creditor could have anyone who owed him money thrown into debtor's jail. The most notorious examples included the Marshalsea, the King's Bench and the Fleet in London. All of these have long since disappeared, but grim images of debtors' jails live on in popular imagination and literature. Charles Dickens, whose own father was thrown into debtor's jail in 1823, knew only too well the desperation and utter humiliation of being in debt.
Please, please, sir, have mercy on us, please.
Look, my friend, you don't really mean to say that human beings live in those wretched dungeons?
Don't I? Why shouldn't I?
What, live? Live down there?
Yeah, and die down there too, pretty often.
The full horror of being in debtor's jail was known only too well by inmates here at Oxford's Old County Jail. Debtors were held separately from other prisoners in a great castellated tower. Often whole families would be locked up. And while convicted thieves and murderers were held in jail for just a few days before being deported or executed, debtors could be held indefinitely. Strangely, being in debt was not a crime, but from as far back as 1352, people were locked up as a way of forcing them to pay their debts. In theory, debtors were set free once they'd paid back their debts, but many who owed just a few shillings spent the rest of their lives behind bars. Just how bad life was for the debtor depended on the jailer. Many were corrupt, intent on making money, so jails were run as very lucrative businesses. Despite their debts, debtors had to pay for everything, and often prices were so inflated, debtors couldn't afford even the basics like food, drink and bedding. The result was often appalling suffering, starvation and death. In 1848, there were no fewer than 250 debtors incarcerated in this tower. The poorest debtors were packed into cells, marked out by these timbers. They were tiny, dark, dank and insanitary. It was unbelievably grim. In desperation, impoverished debtors at Oxford protested about their suffering and begged for help. An extraordinary series of petitions survives from poor debtors, some dating back to as far as the 17th century. This one from 1698. The jailer shuts up poor debtors in a dungeon at his pleasure without bread, drink, fire, candles, or a bed to lay on. And one from 1727, our poverty makes us very badly used by the jailer. First, we are locked up in a very cold place, which hath caused some of us to be sick. Often conditions were so bad that disease spread like wildfire. The walls of this staircase had been lime-washed many, many times, in the vain hope it would counter the scourge of jail fever caused by body lice. It claimed thousands of lives. Not surprisingly, debtors would go to any lengths to avoid imprisonment. One way was to exploit the ancient right of sanctuary that existed around royal palaces. At the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh, hundreds of debtors sought sanctuary from their creditors living in hovels within the sanctuary area, whose boundaries were marked by an S in the cobbles. But on Sundays, debtors could not be arrested wherever they were, so at the crack of dawn they rushed home to wash and stock up with supplies for the coming week. One famous debtor, Lord George Loftus, would spend all week in the sanctuary of Windsor Castle, but on Sundays he would go out and live the high life with his friends. But one fateful Sunday after a drunken dinner, and thinking he'd left in time to get back to the sanctuary, he was arrested in the street and led off to jail. Alas, poor George, his friends, bribed by his creditors, had turned back the clock by an hour to catch him out. But for the well-heeled, the debtors' jail was not as bad as history has made out. At Lancaster's Old County Jail, a very different picture of life in debtors' jail has emerged. For gentlemen debtors or even industrious artisans, loss of liberty didn't always mean loss of comfort. Indeed, many debtors weren't even poverty-stricken, and some even chose to avoid debts in the long term by staying in debtors' jail indefinitely. The key to living the good life in debtors' jail was to avoid paying anything to your creditors and taking all the money you'd got into jail with you. So clever debtors could owe thousands but still be cash rich in jail, paying their jailers for the best accommodation, food, tobacco, alcohol, and even pleasures of the flesh. Some people, called politic debtors, even ran up huge debts deliberately in the certain knowledge they'd be sent to jail where they could live the life of Riley with all the money they'd borrowed. At Lancaster Debtors' Jail, an extraordinary record of the lives of the inmates of the early 19th century still survives. A series of sketches done by the debtor Edward Slack, known in the jail as the briefless barrister. I'm in the snug and you can see his sketch of that here. Men sitting around smoking pipes and drinking coffee by the fireplace. Each room had its own name and price, or garnish, according to its size and the number of chummies you shared with. The smugglers was for middle-ranking debtors, while constables was the communal dining room. Membership cost 5 shillings. The more spacious the rooms, the more expensive they were, and the more likely it was that inmates would bring in from home their own furniture and possessions. Artisan debtors would bring their tools with them and continue their trades, spinning, knitting, brewing or cobbling. They could pay off their debts by selling their wares. Evidence of such industry was discovered during recent renovations, when these shoes were found bricked up inside a wall. Their fine quality would suggest they were either made for sale outside the jail or for a rich debtor inside. Here in the courtyard, stalls were set out selling the goods artisan debtors had made, as well as ale, tobacco and food. The courtyard was also used for games, and some jails were even centres of sporting excellence. Amazingly, one debtor, Robert Mackay, became world rackets champion in 1820. Discipline was notoriously lax. Some jailers could even be bribed to allow debtors to escape at the dead of night. As the abuses of the system multiplied, a campaign against debtors' jails gathered pace, and the archaic laws were gradually changed. At last, in 1869, most debtors were released from jails around the country, including Oxford and Lancaster, and modern laws of bankruptcy were introduced. Maybe we'll never know the names and the fate of so many people who passed through doors like these, but perhaps more than any other old buildings, debtors' jails echo the perilous nature of human existence through the centuries.